Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Tania Fernandez Anderson, District 7 City Councilor. I am the chair of the Boston City Council Committee on Ways and Means. I am joined by my colleagues, Councilor Brian Worrell, the Vice Chair on Ways and Means, Councilor President Ed Flynn, District 2, Councilor President Julia Mejia, at large, Councilor Lara, District 6, Councilor Liz Braden, District 9. The hearing is being recorded. It is being live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, FiOS Channel 964. Written comments may be sent to the committee, email at ccc.wm@boston.gov, and will be made a part of the record and available to all councilors. Public testimony will be taken at the end of this hearing. If you wish to sign up for public testimony here in the chamber, please sign in the sheet near to the door. If you are looking to testify virtually, please email Shane Pack at shane.pack@boston.gov for the link, and your name will be added to the list. Today's hearing is on docket 0322, order for a hearing to discuss how the city budget is addressing equity. I wanted to just address the panelists today, and just for the process that I'll be using today. I will be asking for administration to, or members of the administration to present, and then moving on to community panelists. Today I am joined by Chief Mariangeli Soares Cervera, Chief of Equity and Inclusion, Office of Equity and Inclusion Cabinet, Alex Lawrence, Chief People Officer, you'll have to explain that to me, Department of Human Services, Ashley Goffenberger, Chief Financial Officer, Collector Treasurer for Treasury Department, Santiago Garces, Chief Information Officer, Department of Innovation and Technology. For my community panelist, Dr. Omorala Fateh-Regun, founder and CEO of Thrive. And virtually, we have Eliza Parad, Director of Municipal Democracy, Center for Economic Democracy. And without further ado, I'd like to hear your presentation, and then we'll move on to Dr. Fateh-Regun.
Shane, is it ready for the clicker? Here we go. Thank you so much. Is this loud enough? Is this loud ugh? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Mariangeli, Chief of Equity and Inclusion. I'm joined here today by colleagues that I get to work with on a daily basis. You'll hear a lot more from them in just a second, but I will have brief remarks, about 4 to 5 minutes. My role today is threefold. First, sort of set the stage for our remarks to make sure that we are all aligned in the language that we are using around equity and inclusion. Second, also going to talk about what our cabinet is in charge of, how we work with other departments across the workforce, so that we all have an understanding of like how we collaborate with each other. And last but not least, I'll talk about 3 different initiatives that I'm working on with the folks on this panel to ensure that we are embedding the principle of equity, which is so essential to our administration. Okay. So, like I said, first I'd like to set the foundation on our first ever citywide equity and inclusion statement, which was launched a little bit less than a year ago.
I apologize,
yes.
Chief Mariangeli.
Of course.
Can we have a copy, of the presentations?
Of course.
Does everyone have it in their email? Does everyone have access to digital or a physical copy?
Okay, so I guess just 3 or 4, please?
Thank you so much. Apologies, Chief.
No worries. Want me to pause, or
I think you can keep going.
how about this? I'll give sort of the reason why this was created, right? It's not necessarily the answer to everything, but I think for us as an 18,000 plus workforce, it's important for us to have aligned definitions on the work that we're doing and that the language itself is accessible. And so I'll read it verbatim as we're getting some copies. The City of Boston has played a role in causing and perpetuating the inequities in our society. And to break down these barriers, we are embedding equity and inclusion into everything that we do. We define equity as ensuring every community has the resources it needs, particularly folks from historically excluded communities, which you'll see in just a second who those are for our city. And this requires that we are engaging in an active process of meeting people where they are. Inclusion is about engaging with every resident so that we become a more welcoming city. And as you'll hear from Chief Lawrence in just a second, in order for us to build a city for everyone, we have to believe that diversity makes us a more empowered collective. And so this is a statement that we are using as a guiding principle to the different, so that all departments are working towards the same understanding of what equity is, right? We learned that most folks did not have the same understanding when we first came in as an administration. Okay.
Sorry, Chief. Unfortunately, I can't see it, and I'm trying to get an access
Can I?
digitally. I think we're waiting for copies, and then we'll be good.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go on recess.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You should have access to I think it's because you're right.
We're back in session. Chief, sorry, apologies for the
Thank
interruption. Please proceed.
Excellent. All right, so once the slides come back up, you'll see sort of like what our role as an equity and inclusion cabinet is, what our role is in the larger workforce. We're here our focus is to transform city practices, programs, and policies to ensure that every resident has full access to the resources that the City of Boston has to offer. First, we directly work with residents and for residents to improve outcomes. Second, which is really the focus of today, we counsel different city departments to better address issues of equity, inclusion, and access. And last but not least, we believe that we are well positioned to facilitate the conditions for residents to build their own collective power, right? They guide us in the work that we do. Just for awareness, these are the 8 departments that are under the Equity and Inclusion Cabinet. Some of you are probably very familiar with some of them. Some have been established for longer than 3 decades. Some are essentially startups that launched last year. And so one of the roles that I play as the chief is ensuring that we provide the administrative supports to these different departments so that they can execute their own missions and goals. Second is to ensure that I am the liaison between them and the rest of the cabinet, the mayor's cabinet, to ensure that their priorities are also taken into account, and that we build in some of these more proactive protocols to embed equity and inclusion into the work, which 3 you'll hear of today. And last but not least is making sure that they're also collaborating across each other, so we get into the conversation around intersectionality. Aside from the 8 different departments, we also have what is known as the Equity and Inclusion Office, which provides the services I just named, plus our own initiatives, which we're limiting to 3 at the moment, because we too are a fairly new cabinet. But first, we have our different initiatives around racial justice. That's where the different work streams that someone, for example, like our senior advisor on racial justice, Lori Nelson, takes on. We also have our inaugural Supporting Indigenous Communities Fellow. It's a partnership with the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, exploring really how should the city be working with the different nations, tribes, communities within the complexity of those conversations. And then last but not least, we have the employee resource groups, which is just an opportunity for staff that share different identities and cultures to create a sense of belonging here in the city. All of this takes us to how we as a cabinet are working with the finance cabinet, the people ops cabinet, as well as the innovation and technology department to embed equity and inclusion into how we allocate resources as a city. We have, let me go through my notes, make sure I don't miss any of the important details. First, we've been working very closely with the Finance Cabinet and DoIT's analytics team to develop demographic data collection standards for ARPA grants, with the goal of ensuring that we have a systemic knowledge of the demographics of the leaders of the organizations that we are granting funding for. Also, to ensure that we are better understanding the demographics of the residents served by these different grants. That's some of the work that we've been on, but that's been ongoing for the last 6 months. There's going to be a community engagement process, et cetera. The second bucket of the work, which we've been working really closely with Alex Lawrence, is a compensation study prioritization criteria. Essentially, the question is, how do we ensure that as we're looking at compensation studies opportunities, how do we ensure that we are adding a racial equity lens into these different opportunities? So setting a norm that we are actually following a rubric and ensuring that we are making those determinations for the best interest of our historically excluded communities that are also our staff. And then last but not least, we're beginning to explore how the city can systemically and equitably prioritize renovation of certain city buildings through a capital budget prioritization criteria. We've looked at models across other cities. We haven't found an ideal model. So we are still in the research part of the exploration to ensure that we can find something that works for our organization as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ashley, who will walk us through our financial cabinet.
Great. Good afternoon, councilors. Ashley Grafenberger, Chief Financial Officer. Thanks for having us here today to talk about this important work. So as I think about equity in our budget process, it's really part of everything we seek to embed at every part of our process. Today I'm going to focus kind of on 3 points in the process and highlight some ways in which we are embedding equity into those processes. I'll talk about engagement, how we engage with our residents, how we incorporate equity into our decision making around the budget, and how we implement decisions and measure impact. So the mayor has really made equity a core tenet of her administration, and that all of the work is rooted in community and has set an expectation with all of us in the cabinet and the administration that community is really at the root of the work that we do. We recognize that how the city allocates resources is a really important tool in addressing equity across Boston, but often that process can be confusing and result in residents feeling left out or excluded from that process. So to address this challenge, this fall, the Budget Office took a new approach to budget engagement. The budget team did a series of robust, intensive engagement workshops with various groups throughout the city in collaboration with the departments you see listed here. The goal of these workshops was to empower citizens with the information and residents with the information they need to engage with the process, create some transparency in that process, and really seek to demystify that work. This is just one example of engagement that we have tried, and we recognize that there's no one perfect solution to reach all residents. So as you know, coming soon, we are working to stand up the Office of Participatory Budgeting and the External Oversight Panel, or board that goes along with that. So we're excited for that to be a new point of engagement in the process. And I think continuously happening is the work of the entire administration to ensure, again, that community is at the root of the work we're doing and is part of that consideration from the very beginning. So many factors go into decisions and how we make budget decisions. How much money is available, different priorities, and what is the anticipated impact of those decisions. We in the Finance Cabinet and the Budget Office has included equity questions in the required materials that departments submit along with budget proposals so that equity considerations and impacts are taken into account at the beginning of the process rather than later on. These questions include: how does the budget proposal address racial, gender, or economic disparities? How have impacted communities been involved in the development of the proposal? In the case of a competitive procurement, how will the procurement seek to create opportunities for small, minority, women-owned businesses? And most importantly, how will we know that we have achieved those goals? How will we know if we're successful? These answers to these questions provide important context and information that are reviewed and considered when deciding, making budget decisions, and how we allocate funds throughout our budget process. We utilize a similar set of questions to accompany our capital plan development, and they're listed here. Sorry, the text is a little bit small, but the questions focus on what is the location of the work, who is the project for, and who will it impact? And it's important to understand that who the project is for could be different than the person it will impact. How will it be implemented, and are there opportunities for minority and women-owned business engagement? What is the plan for community engagement if the project were to move forward? And very importantly, what are the intended outcomes? And again, how will we know if we have achieved those? And then I think my last slide today is talking a little bit about how we utilized equity in the development and implementation of the American Rescue Plan funds, or ARPA. So equity, again, is a core tenet in both the decision-making behind ARPA and how the administration is implementing ARPA-funded programs as well. During the decision-making process, we focused on cross-departmental ideas that address equity, climate justice, jobs, and health. The federal rules themselves put an emphasis on spending ARPA funds in low-income communities and qualified census tracts by making these areas eligible for additional investments to rectify the health, educational, and housing disparities that were exacerbated by COVID-19. And our decision-making process was guided by a data and community-informed approach. We relied on partners in the City Council, the city's Equitable Recovery Coordinating Committee, and other community feedback as we were making decisions around allocations. And we're ensuring that equity remains a central part of the implementation of these programs. We've reserved pools of funding for language access and evaluation to ensure that departments have what they need to make ARPA-funded initiatives accessible and measure their impact. The Finance Cabinet is working with our colleagues in the Equity and Inclusion Cabinet and the Analytics team to conduct focus groups with different city departments to learn more about their demographic data collection practices, and are working towards piloting a standard set of demographic questions with individuals and nonprofits so we can look across projects and departments and measure impact. And finally, all projects with ARPA funding are required to submit information on how they will engage the community and promote equitable outcomes through quarterly and annual reports, which we do post publicly. I will reiterate, I feel like I've said this many times, so I apologize if this is a repeat, but equity in budget allocation is crucial, and so is incorporating it into the implementation of the programs so that we meet the goals that we initially set out to in the allocation process. And I think what the ARPA example really highlights, it's a bit of a best practice in how we both allocate funds and measure the impact that we hope to be able to roll out in a broader way to the rest of our budget decisions and how we make those decisions and how we measure the impact of those allocations. And I think that's it for me. So with that, I will turn it over to Chief Lawrence.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me today. So I'll explain just very briefly. I'm Alex Lawrence. I run the People Operations Cabinet. We are a brand new cabinet we did not exist during the last budget cycle. And so I have sat in this chamber before, but not in this particular role. Prior to creating the People Operations Cabinet, all of Human Resources and the Office of Labor Relations, as well as the Registry, all orged up to the CFO, along with 7 other departments that a pretty busy CFO also had to manage. And so the whole concept between the People Operations Cabinet is to sort of give our employees and center our employees to have a seat at the table in the mayor's cabinet making decision. And so as I oversee the Office of Human Resources and the Office of Labor Relations, as well as having a central People Operations Cabinet, I'm able to really focus on the workforce and exclusively spend all of my time thinking about how we make the city of Boston the best possible employer and continue to attract and retain the best possible talent. There we go. So yes, so I have not yet had a full budget cycle in this role, and therefore wanted to talk, to sort of begin by setting the stage to say that in terms of embedding equity in all of our work and thinking about the entirety of our workforce, there was definitely a bunch of restructuring work and revamping some of our internal operations to be able to help us move the needle on such incredibly important goals. And so I wanted to just really talk about 3 roles that were the first, or 3 of the first hires that I made that didn't exist before, that again enable us to be successful in the work that we're setting out to do. Previously, we had a director of human resources, and we now have that role as the executive director of people and culture. And the idea is really centering, like, even thinking about the word human resources or labor, right? We're viewing people like primarily as their work product, and so really centering humans in even the title and the language we use around human resources was one of the early things we wanted to do. So we brought on Brenda Hernandez to be our first executive director of people and culture, who runs our HR organization. She comes from a deep equity work background. She was the former chief of equity for Planned Parenthood of Massachusetts, and just has an incredibly strong DEI background to help lead this work forward. And so, yeah, we've done a bunch of work to restructure the HR department to really enable us to focus on people and culture. And one of the early things that Brenda brought with her was helping us use a racial equity impact assessment tool to evaluate the projects that we take on. So we're laser focused on ensuring that as we take on work, that we're thinking about the disparate impacts of how that affects different employees' racial groups as one of the forefront things we do to evaluate the work that we take on. We also created a director of diversity position, and shout out to City Councilor Mejia and Councilor Ricardo Arroyo, part of one of the ordinances they passed was the Fair Chance Act, which created a position, the Director of Diversity, which enabled me to make this one of my very first hires into the cabinet. And so in collaboration with council, one of our very first hires was creating a Director of Diversity. And we use that language very intentionally to not, like, equity and inclusion is incredibly important work. It's work that Chief Solis Cervera and I work together on across the day. It is work that all of us should be doing. And so having someone laser focused specifically on diversity, thinking, you know, again, there's so much work we could do here, but moving the needle on ensuring that we have a diverse workforce in and of itself is an incredibly important goal. And then I think another thing that we had heard a lot and that I think is certainly deeply talked about in the Fair Chance Act and a lot of the work that we've had is that employees, I think it was quite expressed clearly that they did not feel like they had a very clear path about how to report discrimination or inequity or anything that happened in the workforce that they wanted to take seriously. And so one of the other really early positions was rebuilding our employee relations function for the city, which had sort of not been a huge central focus for a pretty long time. And so employee relations is essentially that sort of like glue between where labor and HR and law intersect, creating incredibly clear processes and pathways for employees to report any sort of wrongdoing, discrimination, misconduct that happens in the workplace, and just making both our responses to that more timely, clear, and well-staffed was a huge thing that we wanted to do early on. And so we brought on a director of that function. We brought on an investigator. Labor had been providing that role, but there was a ton of work that we needed to do to rebuild that function. So those were early things that we did. I just wanted to, sorry for all of that explanation, but sort of explain how we laid out the early focus of our cabinet to lay the infrastructure for us to be able to have success in any of the ways that we wanted to increase both equity and diversity across our workforce. So some of the things that we've been working on a lot of things over the last, I don't know how long I've been here in this role, 8 months, maybe, something like that. 8 months, does that seem right? Yes. Yeah, okay. What is time? So really focusing on prioritizing efforts that encourage retention, promotional opportunities, and interdepartmental connections for all City of Boston employees with a focus on those who have been historically marginalized. And so what that has looked like is working with all of our HR partners in departments to establish more consistent, equitable hiring processes, doing just recruiting and hiring 101 across the city. I think there's just a ton of learning and growing that we all need to do to figure out how to recruit in the most active, community-driven, expansive way we can. Doing some deep dives with our police and fire departments to just help improve the diversity and recruiting for the cadet programs, and expanding and publicizing a bunch of pipelining opportunities, including the Mayor's Office internship program. I know a lot of the questions that Chair Fernandez-Anderson had asked us in advance have to do with data and how we can demonstrate progress over time. And after this, I'm going to show you a couple of slides with data in it. But I wanted to start by saying that our data itself is not good in terms of our workforce. The way that our current systems track, I would say, race data conflates race with ethnicity. We have 4 categories that we collect: Hispanic, Black, Asian, and white. We need to fix that, and we need to fix that immediately. It involves being able to upgrade our technology systems. So thankfully we have my partner in crime, Santi Garces, here to talk about that. Also, our gender categories are not particularly expansive or inclusive, which multiple things that the council has certainly been advocating for point to. And those are just sort of those. It sounds like it should be an easy thing to fix. It includes us just making a bunch of technical infrastructure changes in order to create new categories. That is work that we are prioritizing and doing in short order so that we have basically the long and short of it is I can show you some data. It's not that meaningful. I think the same across how we track promotional opportunities because of how both the nature of collective bargaining and how we think about promotions at the city. It's not exactly what you might think in terms of a promotion. People can apply for different jobs. And so how we track what is viewed as a promotion is a really challenging thing to do. So all of this to say, we're trying to do a lot of work to get that data right from the start so that we can better track our progress. So I can show you some of that, but it is not nearly as meaningful as we'd want it to be. And then finally, we're piloting innovative ways to expand employee benefits across our organization and really allowing that to be employee-driven. So Mary Angeli talked about the employee resource groups, really using that as sort of the mouthpiece and the way that employees can tell us the things that they care about so that we can be responsive to their needs. So both the employee transit benefits and the visa sponsorship programs that we've rolled out have been specific asks that came from employee resource groups. So now on to show you just a little bit of the data that you asked for, and again, acknowledging that this is not a particularly meaningful set of graphs, but it was what we're able to provide right now, given the data that we have. You had asked about diversity in our new hires, and so I think the high-level story that I'll say, so we've separated this into black females, black males, and then other racial identities, which is the sort of questions that we had gotten in advance. And I think what we basically see is that across black employees as compared to other ethnicities, it's remained pretty steady over the years, which is not where we want to be moving the needle. And so we certainly have some work to do here. That is why we are really focused on this work and bringing folks in to help us move the needle. And then I think on diversity and retention rates, we also broke this down in the same group. I think the story that you'll see here is probably not particularly surprising. You will see that between 2018 and 2020, our retention rates increased, and then after 2020, they decreased, and that is a trend we're really hoping to correct, but there's not a particularly significant difference across racial or ethnic groups in terms of retention, is what the data shows in aggregate. And that is it for me. I will hand it over to Santi now.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Chief, do you have numbers?
Like actual people?
Yeah. I mean, how did you get to this percentage? There was some data collected. Whether or not they weren't very good with the subcategories, but you have numbers?
I can provide you, or numbers for what specifically? Yes, we have numbers we can provide you with whatever you'd like. You can see the numbers in the static snapshot, but if you want over time,
sure. 2018 to present in terms of this graph here, do you have, can you give me this in actual data, in actual numbers?
Yeah, counts?
Yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. You'll provide that, you'll send that to me?
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
You.
Hello, council members. This is Santiago Garces. I am the Chief Information Officer of the city. Again, as a way of context, the Department of Innovation and Technology includes the city-wide analytics team. I'm the Chief Data Officer, as well as other teams that help support the work of the city. And I think that if nothing else, you'll notice that we all work very closely together, and our teams work closely together to both help design, track, evaluate, and continue to drive progress for the city. So you had asked some initial questions around the makeup of the city. These are some data that we have from the census around the breakup of the demographics and ethnicity of the city. The data comes from the latest census count, as well from the American Community Survey. And that is also what gives us the number of foreign-born residents, as well as the percentage of non-citizens that live in the city.
Mr. Garces,
Yeah.
do you have the comparison demographics to employees?
We could calculate that. Whenever we submit you the follow-up with Alex, we'd be happy to share with you.
Thank you.
Percentages within those years.
So what I'm asking for is, here you gave me, to the best of your ability from Census and ACS, charts of data US, and you gave me the, this is for Boston, right?
That is for Boston, 2020.
Mm-hmm. And then it says, for example, 44%, 44.7% white, and so if I could get the same in employees for the city of Boston, and then if I could get the ratio comparison. Thank you.
Yes, and one of the things that sorry, I don't know where the computer that drives this is. There you go. So one of the things that we have worked to do, both as a city but as a nation, is working on updating the way that we track, the categories that we use, the language that we use, because it is important for people to feel represented. one of the things that when Alex mentioned that the data is not good, I would phrase it, the data that we use does not match even the existing categories. And we know that the existing categories don't, like even when we talk with partners at the federal level, that there's a desire to update those categories. And the intersectionality of race with ethnicity and origin and other things are important when we think about disparities around language disparities and other experiences. So I wanted to share a little bit some of the challenges that we have around this work, but then also some of the things that we're doing to try to mitigate against these. So you had asked, how do we know where different groups live within the city? And the answer to that is the best practice is to use the American Community Survey, which is this update every year that the census provides. The challenge is that the American Community Survey, once we get to the census tract level, is a 5-year rolling average. So although we get that geographic precision, we lose a little bit in terms of the temporal precision. We don't know about some of the data that we're looking at is older. The second thing that is challenging is the way that the census provides us with the data is disaggregated. So we can look at, let's say, race or ethnicity and income, but it is very difficult for us to see the tie between the two of them, because that's not the way that the data is presented. But in answer to that, we've been working with other departments, and I think that as part of the American Rescue Plan Act and then work that we've been doing in partnership with the Policy Office and others, we've been trying to get at how is it that we do impact evaluation and program evaluation at the program level to be able to understand the impact of those investments. So I think that there's like examples of this in the Office of Economic Empowerment and Opportunity and others. That is the second piece that I mentioned. The categories don't necessarily align, and this is true for race and ethnicity as well as for gender. We have started working, and I'll share with you shortly about how we're starting to approach that for gender first, and the marriage licensing process is the one that we've been using to do a lot of engagement precisely because it has such a high impact in the potential impacts for the people that participate in that process around gender. And our hope is to take those lessons and carry them over for the employment side of things so that we can track things consistently. And the third one is, some of your questions are great questions. They're actually difficult from a methodology standpoint, from the statistics of how is it that we make sure that an impact, let's say when we invest in resurfacing a road or a park or a community center, what is the community that asset or that product serves? So, because it varies depending on, the different communities might ride through the same road, different groups. So it is a little bit tricky to track specifically who gets impacted with each decision, but as Alex mentioned, we're starting to become more intentional before we make these investments, and as Ashley mentioned as well, we're asking the people that are executing the funding, that are planning on doing the work, to engage with community, to understand the impact, and then to verify and understand the impact of the work and the investments. The last piece is, and we've had this conversation with Councilor Worrell and with others, our office and our department has visibility into some of the main enterprise systems, but there's a lot of data systems and a lot of work that happens outside of the kind of central IT world. We don't have visibility, and I think that to that extent, whatever we can do to start bringing consistency of experience across the board, that is a key part. Even when an employee gets hired in the public schools versus other parts of the city, they'll go through different systems, some of which we don't manage, but we want to make sure that if we're providing a good, equitable experience, it should be consistent regardless of where in the city you're interacting with. And on that note as well, we've had some conversations with some council members about there's a need to invest in the capacity of data and having that baseline of information about our assets, their conditions, and that is work that is fundamental to be able to understand disparities and even just from an operational perspective, and we're working to that goal, but it is a lot of work, and I wish that I could say that we're ahead of the game here. We're catching up. Just wanted to briefly share with you a little bit how we're approaching this question of how we encode gender, and in the case of a marriage certificate, you're also encoding sexual orientation implicitly. There's some ordinances passed, the gender inclusion ordinance by the council, but when we started having conversations with Alex and with Patty McMahon, who is the leader of the registry at that point, instead of just jumping and starting to make changes to the categories, we figured that it was important to us to engage with the communities that were going to be impacted. And it was interesting because when we talked to some of the advocates and those community members, their initial reaction was, why are you asking us? You never care about what we think. We said, this is why we want to engage with you. We want to understand what are your hesitations, what are your concerns, how do you perceive the process so that we can design our system to meet your need. And we conducted interviews with over 130 constituents, members of the LGBTQ+ community, held a number of different focus groups, and again, we made sure that we had representation from the non-binary community, from the transgender community, and we started hearing about things that we would have probably missed if we had jumped straight to solutions. We had heard from some members that actually they preferred not to be identified at all because the risk to themselves was higher than being able to be tracked and for us to be able to see disparities in the process. So anyways, we're wrapping up this engagement process, and the hope is that we come up with both guidelines around how, on the HR and employee side of things, how is it that we design constituent services that are respectful for people of different gender identities, that we create the processes that support those, and finally that we capture the data in the systems in a way that is consistent with this way. And once we finish with the marriage license process, we will go to our human service, our HR records and our hiring data. And you had asked the question as well of what are key investments that we think, based on the data and our understanding, that would have a big impact in equity. Here actually, and again, we spent a fair amount of time looking at research and data from the city's operations and also benchmarks from other communities. And I think that the data shows that the mayor's agenda of investing in housing, in youth, and in climate resilience, we do think that those are tied with some of the greatest opportunities for addressing inequality in the city. So I wanted to tie that up, but I think that is all that I have.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Morella, you have the floor.
Sure.
Can you send over the clicker?
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, counselors, for having me. My name is Omalara Fatirigan, and I'm CEO of a company called Thrive, and we help municipalities create equity-centered budgets. And I'll get to all of that, but I wanted to just share a little bit about my background and my connection to Boston and the surrounding area. I first came here as a teenager to go to Harvard College, and my connection to Boston didn't end with graduation. I've worked for a long time in philanthropy, and so we were able to make investments in Dorchester Youth Collaborative, in North Star Learning Center that's out in New Bedford. When I was senior fellow at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, we worked with the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families and the Providence Public School District to actually get both agencies to pool their financial resources together and focus on investments in programs with empirical proof of efficacy in other communities across the country. And it was actually after getting a master's degree and working for 20 years that at my advanced age, I thought I should go and get a doctorate. So I did that and finished last year at Harvard. And it was when I was back in school again, I really started thinking about operationalizing equity through budgets, and hence this company. And the reason why looking at budgets is so important, for me, it has personal significance and also professional significance. And so on a personal level, I'm the child of immigrants, but my dad went back to Nigeria. Both my parents are Nigerian. And so my mom became a single, low-income Black woman in inner-city Philadelphia raising 2 kids. That always is not a story with a happy ending, but somehow my brother and I both went to Harvard College. How did that happen? It was a budget decision. My mom worked for a university, Thomas Jefferson University, and they made the decision to offer free college to their employees. That allowed mom to go to school at night, become a pharmacist, and transition us out of poverty. And so this one financial decision by one institution unlocked the American dream for my 2 generations of my family. I know from my hard work in government that how money is deployed can also change lives for better or for worse. And so I was deputy director of DC's Juvenile Justice Agency, which meant that I was 2 steps down from the mayor. The first thing I did was to conduct an internal assessment of how we were spending our resources. And I found that our resource allocations were linked to rising rearrest rates. How did that happen? Well, long story short, we were investing in programs that researchers had known to be ineffective for 30 years. And so this taught me that really hard-working, well-meaning government employees often just don't have access to the resources and the information and the research that they need to improve their decision-making. And this really is where Thrive came from. What we've done is we've created software that kind of bundles the academic research, best practices from communities of color. We've interviewed cabinet-level government officials, and then we combine all of that information on what works specifically to mitigate disparities experienced by people of color. So we bundle all that info into an index, and then we compare the index of what works and what doesn't work to what the government is actually spending money on. And then we provide, report cards, red light, yellow light, green light, and some recommendations on improved resource allocation. And we've created these Thrive guides, these modules, these spending modules for various agencies, schools, maternal child health. We can look at future of work, procurement processes, et cetera. But we're more than a software company. Once we've conducted these assessments, we facilitate a dialogue between government officials and community organizations to really understand the information, to vet our own solutions and recommendations, and then to co-create a budget, prioritize next steps together. I'm going to skip the next slide, hopefully. And try to explain exactly how do we do this. Amazing that the administration is focused on youth. One way to explore whether or not the jurisdiction is spending money equitably is looking at targeted investments for vulnerable populations. In this case, we can look at opportunity youth. Opportunity youth are typically defined as young people between the ages of 16 and 24 who are disconnected from school and work. So we look at investments in job training programs, upskilling, workforce development, per capita investments on opportunity youth, per capita investments on homeless youth. We know this population often struggles with housing insecurity. And then we want to look at the diversity of providers that the city is investing in to support this particular population. You can look at different departments within a government. For example, Parks and Recreation. How do you know if you're spending equitably when it comes to Parks and Rec? Access. This is a beautiful park on the screen. does every part of the city have a park that looks just like this? And so we look at tree canopy by neighborhoods or zip codes, access to green space by neighborhoods or zip codes. We also look at investments, so who gets the new pool, who gets the new playground, what neighborhoods are those located in? These are all different metrics for assessing equity, perhaps in parks and recreation departments. In terms of procurement and city operations, we want to look at the diversity of vendors, women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, but we want to look at award amounts, the lengths of awards, any particular responsibilities related to subcontractors and what those requirements are, renewal rates, and job creation by vendors that the city is employing. Additionally, we can look at public schools, for example, weighted student funding formulas, and if those funding formulas are actually operating in such a way that we're mitigating the achievement gap. Various measures related to post-COVID kind of recovery. High dosage tutoring is super impactful. Our district's actually doing some of these things. The ratios of different types of investments, how much are we spending on behavioral health in comparison to school resource officers, just making sure we have a view of the district that isn't skewed. And for different agencies or priority areas that we know are important to traditionally disadvantaged communities, where we can focus on maternal child health, future of work, mental health, telemedicine, housing, etc. Go to the next slide. What's really important is to shift how we allocate resources and also to monitor and evaluate over time. So we want to know that if we've invested in nurse home visiting programs, for example, are there real outcomes when it comes to infant mortality or other areas. So we want to be able to monitor new investments over time, and our company helps school districts and municipalities do that. So we did our first pilot in the City of Somerville Health Department. In Summer Promise, they have an amazing Cradle to Career network, and we were asked to explore that kind of shifting money, but also shifting power. So the extent to which the government was really open to hearing how recipients of services wanted to shift what they were getting from the health department. They were very successful, parents were very successful in advocating for programming for them. So up until that point, the Cradle to Career Network did everything possible for a child. And parents said, this is great, but we need stuff too, right? Like job training programs, language classes. And in fact, the parents said the same thing that my mom would have said, and also all of the literature says. The Urban Institute and Northwestern have found that you have a multiplicative effect on breaking cycles of poverty when you implement two-generational programming. So programming for kid, but also programming for parent caregiver. And so that is what parents in Somerville requested. And the department was able to reallocate resources to social workers to help navigate parents to those community-based programs. Aside from, we're also working in Cambridge Public Schools. We have a 2-year engagement to, in year 1, explore the extent to which the budget planning process is equitable, and in year 2, look at specific resource allocation school by school and every school in the district to better tweak how resources are allocated to mitigate the achievement gap, whether it's attendance, test scores, et cetera, school by school. Beyond Thrive, I wanted to just share some really compelling examples of how municipalities across the country are really targeting their investments to drive equitable outcomes. And so in DC, we have the Baby Bonds program. If you're a baby born after October 2021, your family is enrolled in Medicaid and your household income is below a specific threshold, you get a baby bank account. A $500 initial deposit, and in every subsequent year, a $1,000, up to a max of $1,000 deposit. And so in DC, they are addressing the racial wealth gap literally from birth. And so that's one way to kind of focus those investments. In Baltimore, they're really combating infant mortality rates. So when I was at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, we invested in this program, Be More Baltimore, for healthy babies. We invested in nurse home visiting programs and also kind of re-exploring community collective impact in such a way that it is anti-racist. We're kind of elevating indigenous community organizations and not kind of the mega organizations that typically get all of the kind of procurement dollars. And so through that process, Baltimore was able to decrease infant mortality by 28% and mitigate the black-white disparity in infant deaths by 40%. And so this is one example from Baltimore when it comes to maternal child health investments. In Minnesota, they're really looking at small women in particular. And so you can think of it like small business meets early care and education. So the state of Minnesota is investing $3 million almost in childcare providers who are typically not licensed. They are family, they are friends, they are neighborhood providers. And the government in the state is providing grants to organizations that serve and build the capacity of these not yet licensed providers. Grantees of the state must work with immigrant and refugee communities and provide culturally appropriate trainings that really are all about kind of early care and education. So the state is together working on kind of bolstering small businesses, bolstering childcare providers who typically are women, typically underpaid, and typically minority women, and simultaneously really thinking about early care and education and some of those childhood education outcomes. And so that's a really clever way of kind of putting all of that together through smart investments. Boston is really moving forward with improving equity in housing. And so increasing the density of multifamily housing units. I believe this is an actual unit in Dorchester. Dealing with kind of stabilizing the rent caps and getting all of those affordable units kind of committed from last year is great progress. I would invite the administration and council to consider examples from other cities. So once we actually have all these housing units, we want to make sure that folks who have been historically kind of redlined and not having access actually get access to those units. And so the Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity Advancing Black Home Ownership and another program called Parity in Boston really work on Black and Latinx home ownership. They're really working on flexible debt and credit criteria and technical assistance on a very kind of complicated labyrinthine kind of home buying process. And I would also encourage folks to consider that housing is actually more than just brick and mortar housing. So in the early 2000s, HUD and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did like a 10-year initiative. And in the first 5 years, they realized that, oh my gosh, you can't just provide housing, but you have to actually coordinate social services, small business development, and I would add neighborhood kind of beautification in order to have a really sustained impact. And so those are just some of the examples from my company, and this gives you a teaser on the types of research that we provide when we help municipalities with recommendations for more equitable kind of resource allocation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omolada. I wanted to go to my council colleagues for their first round of questions, and then we can continue on. Oh, okay. We're actually been joined by Eliza Parad, so we can hear from our last panelist and then go to our first round. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Welcome. Please introduce yourself and affiliation.
Sorry to be joining virtually to be able to get the childcare pickup on time. Thank you, Councillor Fernandez Anderson, for holding this hearing on this really important issue, and to the councillors here today, whom I can't see. This is a little strange. But I know you're there. My name is Eliza Parad. I'm the Director of Municipal Democracy at the Center for Economic Democracy, or CED, here in Boston. In my role at CED, I coordinate the Better Budget Alliance, a coalition of 34 community-based organizations across all 9 districts in Boston. And we're working to implement a community-led, equitable, and inclusive participatory budgeting process as a way to lead to more equitable spending in the city and advance racial and economic justice. Participatory budgeting, I think everyone knows what it is now, but just in case, we also call it PB for short. It gives residents direct decision-making over how part of the city's budget is spent through asking residents what issues you're facing and what ideas do you have as solutions to those issues. As you know, Boston will embark on its first citywide process, although we've had youth participatory budgeting since 2014. The first citywide process will be this year, which is really exciting. And however, the process is only as strong as its design. And like any other process, without centering equity in the design along the whole spectrum, it can, and often in other cities where it exists, ends up giving more power and resources to those that already have it, even when that's not the intent. I know that's not the intent of Boston's process, which stated goals are to build collective capacities on issues of racial and social justice and to create an equitable and binding process. And yet there's still several elements around design that we feel are really important in order to make sure that it reaches those goals. Researchers have counted up to 10,000 participatory budgeting processes around the world, and according to the sort of national experts at the participatory budgeting process, there's 5 elements that lead to equitable outcomes. 1 is inclusive design. 2 is equity criteria when determining how to distribute funds. 3 is community grassroots leadership and partnership. 4 is focused outreach to communities that traditionally don't engage in city processes. And 5, a meaningful amount of money for the process. I want to just focus on 2 of those elements for today's hearing. So the first one is the meaningful investment. As we await the release of the budget shortly, I want to again urge the city to set aside a significant amount of funds to be determined through the participatory budgeting process. Cities internationally that have invested over 5% of their budget, it's like around that number when they start to see real material improvements in health, economic, and educational outcomes. Residents know what they need and they have solutions to the challenges that they face. And we know that residents have a lot of ideas about how to spend the money. Even in the first year of Youth Lead the Change, the youth-led PB process, there were over 450 ideas about how to spend just $1 million. And if you totaled those ideas, it would have been many millions of dollars. And that didn't include all residents of Boston. So from conversations that we've been having and our community groups have been having with residents about their hopes, folks have been asking for 1% of the budget, or $40 million, to be determined through participatory budgeting as a baseline, as a starting point, which people feel will allow them to have a real impact and propose significant projects that would impact their communities and their lives, and really start to transform histories of disinvestment and mistrust. So this upcoming budget is an opportunity to shift power back to the residents and let them determine how to invest in their communities. Someone from the Office of Equity Inclusion spoke earlier about residents really guiding the work of the city, and participatory budgeting, I'd say, is the most explicit way to allow residents to do that through budget investments. The level of funding that we're asking for is consistent with findings from a listening tour that Families for Justice's Healing conducted with 150 formerly incarcerated women in Boston in 2020, and is about 1/3 of what the amount residents have been asking for during the last 3 budget cycles around defunding the police and investing in community-led solutions. Families for Justice's Healing in 2020 asked these women what was going on in your lives in the moment when you got caught up in the criminal justice system. And women said they didn't have dignified, stable housing. They didn't have access to affordable, healthy food, affordable childcare, stable, well-paying jobs, and other basic needs. I was recently attended a workshop by Activist, which is a fiscal justice investment research firm that analyzes city budgets for equity investments. And they framed investments in police departments as having 0 ROI or return on investments for Black communities. As our coalition has been meeting with residents across the city, looking at the current budget investments and where we could invest more in participatory budgeting, the first suggestion that everyone has had is moving money out of the police department and into community-led solutions like participatory budgeting. And we saw some of those shifts last year in the budget. And I just want to reiterate again before the budget comes out shortly that communities are still waiting and hoping for more of that shift. The other piece to highlight around equity in the budget for participatory budgeting is that studies have shown that when participatory budgeting uses equity formulas, resources get shifted from higher income neighborhoods to lower income neighborhoods. But that doesn't automatically happen without an equity formula. In Los Angeles, for example, the entirety of the participatory budgeting funds are spent in 9 neighborhoods known as LA repair zones. These communities have at least 87% residents of color, at least 16% of residents live in poverty, and they have unemployment rates of at least 15%, and 30% of all renter households paid more than half their income on rent. In Boston, if we looked at something similar, like I was looking at census data from the American Community Survey, if we took neighborhoods with an 18% poverty rate or median income under 70,000 and a majority people of color, the neighborhoods we would be looking at are Roxbury, Chinatown, Mission Hill, Dorchester, and Mattapan. And my guess is East Boston, given census reporting from undocumented immigrants, but perhaps not. But we know that these communities have a history of disinvestment, redlining, and underfunding that has resulted in disparate health, wealth, and educational outcomes, and a history of mistrust. And so, just thinking about the design of this process again, we encourage you to start in those neighborhoods. The disparities in investments are not only historical. Looking at capital investments in the capital budget passed last year, there is a disproportionate distribution of capital investments planned for the next 5 years. The majority of investments by far are going to District 2 and then District 8, which cover some of the neighborhoods with the highest median incomes and lowest poverty rates, again, from the American Community Survey data. Finally, since we're talking about equity in the budget, I'd be remiss if I did not mention the problem of the decreasing compliance with pilot payment in lieu of tax payments from major institutions over the last 10 years since the pilot structure was created. And last year in 2022, only 19 of institutions that owe pilot payments paid their full amount. So again, thinking about the budget this year and equity in the budget, it's really time to reset the expectations and hold these institutions accountable so that we have the revenue especially as, ARPA spending continues to go down, to ensure that the institutions, hospitals, university, and cultural institutions are contributing to city revenue and helping our city. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eliza. I'd like to go straight to our first round, and then we'll go to public testimony for people that are here, then second round, and then anyone online. I'll try to be brief if you guys can be patient with me, to my colleagues, but just some clarification in terms of the questions that I asked. I know that I wrote a book for you, but I did want to just get some clarifications here today, and then hopefully actually get some answers in writing, whatever you have. Like, that's the point of this. Would hate to reschedule another hearing just to get the answers. And I think that just in terms of Ways and Means or budget process, that's kind of the direction we're going. Folks are ready to slow it down and have real conversations. So if I send you RFIs or requests for information, if you don't have, let's work together. So if you don't have the answers right away, send me back with, X marks or whatever, red or green lights, and tell me, okay, here are the answers that I have, and here are the answers that I don't have, or the questions that I could not answer. And I think that is probably a more pragmatic approach, so that way we can begin to actually say, all right, what do we do about this, and how do we find out the answers? For me, just wanted to ask first, Chief Mariangelis and, sorry.
I'm Alex.
Are you just Alex?
Chief Lawrence, if you'd
Chief
like.
Lawrence. Chief Lawrence. Apologies, I always only remember Alex. Chief Lawrence, if you both can tell me, how are you two working together, since it sounds like you're working a lot on diversity, and Mary Angeles, your office is taking an approach to educating, I guess, city employees and departments in terms of what equity and inclusion means, but how is that including diversity? And then also, I guess if you could tell me the demographics of your office itself, and just to speak to people's perspectives in terms of equity perspective.
I would say, I'll let you take the diversity piece, and even why we decided to move that away from my cabinet into yours, into the people's cabinet. But I would say that the way that we are thinking about the compensation study criteria is sort of this sounds so cheesy, but the bread and butter of the work that we want to do with other departments, right? It's we know it's an issue of equity, and we do not have standardized ways of applying these different studies and making decisions as to who goes through these studies first, right? And so the way that we are working with other departments is being able to provide that expertise and direct access to the specific communities, right? And you saw the different departments that we have in our cabinet, right? From LGBTQ, Black male advancement, women's, et cetera, to also being able to provide, we just hired our director of policy and research, so being able to provide some of that research, some of those best practices that other cities, other models are following. Where the partnership, her team has the day-to-day operational, we're staffing up, but the people ops cabinet, right, has the functional, the operational day-to-day, right, functions of being able to hire people, being able to create protocols and services to retain staff. Whereas what we can do is offer the technical assistance to embed something for the long term, right? Right now, the status quo is oftentimes we don't have protocols. My purpose here is to ensure that through the specific voices that we have centered in our cabinet, we're able to create protocols alongside the cabinets that have been well established and that will be here forever, to make sure that they are forever embedding equity into their protocols. So I'll start with that. But
thank you. Chief Lawrence, how do you do that without data or without accurate data?
How do we do which part of
If you're addressing, if she has the tools, if the chief has the tools to actually, offer some of this, training, and you are talking about retaining and looking at the problem. In order for you to retain, you need to have a problem. And you're looking at the problem, but who does it impact? And if you're looking at who does it impact, where's the data? And if you're looking at the data, then you don't know the data. So how do we do that?
So first of all, I mean, the data doesn't not exist. It's just not it is not where we would want it to be. But we still have, for the most part, to the degree to which we legally can, people still, when they are employed by the city, if they choose to answer racial categories that are not great, they still answer those. So we still have some data that help us sort of understand our workforce. So I do want to be clear on that, I wanted to be clear on the caveats of the data and why I think they could be better, but I don't think we have nothing, right? We understand generally what the racial composition of our workforce is in somewhat blunt, overstated categories. So just wanted to clarify that, if that's helpful. But yes, I mean, I think specifically the reason that their previous iterations of a director of diversity position had been in the equity function, and I think just allowing Bernadine as our director of diversity to be incredibly close to our talent acquisition management team, our class and compensation team, as Mariangeli was saying, working with every single one of our recruiters across the city, embedding them within our department. That was sort of the idea there, and then leaning on Mariangeli's team's expertise as we think about sort of specific chunks of work that we really need help thinking about and getting community impact on.
I see. Thank you. I guess my concern with that, or not, I guess when I think about it, I understand that you're trying to address education in terms of equity and inclusion and diversity. You're also trying to retain and also hire new, right, increase diversity. If you don't have accurate data, I guess I can understand that you need to improve, and I appreciate your honesty. But I guess I just don't understand, because if you're being proactive in terms of educating the folks that need this education, who exactly need that education? Who exactly are we supporting? And who is, if we're trying to increase diversity, then, and we don't know the difference, or we don't understand the disparities, then how do we do the work? And so I just think that you'd agree with me that, Chief Lawrence, that data, you have to start with data. I don't see how we can approach this if we don't understand. If I can ask you, what is the demographics of the city and what is the demographics of the employees of the city? You should be able to tell me that. And once you tell me that, I should be able to compare it. But I asked that here, and I didn't get that in the presentation. So I'm curious then, is that part of the data you don't have? Or if you have it, can you provide it to me?
Yeah. We can definitely provide you with more data, I think.
Is that something you could look up right now, or is this something that I have to wait for?
So what I can't give you right this moment is data over time. The diversity dashboard, which is a public-facing dashboard, tells you the breakdown by the categories that we have of every single department in the city today. It's public-facing. You can look at that right now, and I can pull it up if it would be helpful. It's broken down by individual departments, by race and gender, by tenure, by salary. All of that exists. That gives you a point in time.
Then that means you could aggregate it to tell me, in Parks Department, for example, how many Black people are employed there, and then you can also tell me sort of the percentage of pay. You can say, of the whole Parks Department, it's 50% Black, and of that 50%, only one person is in upper management.
Yes, I can definitely
You could do that, okay. And I think that's the number, those are the numbers that we all, including yourself, I heard, is interested in comparing, because then how do we know what the issue is?
Absolutely, yeah. And I do want to say it is a public-facing dashboard, so anyone could access that data today.
Yeah, so say that, I guess I'm going to kindly ask that.
Yeah.
When I send in our RFIs, I don't want to go to the public facing, because I have a responsibility to provide it to the public. So the purpose of our hearings, hopefully, it's to ask on record, to get the answer on record, and then for me to read it on record. The fact that it's public-facing and that it's accessible to me or the public is great, but I think that part of the problem, part of the inequity, is that there is lack of access, so people may not even know or have ability to get to it. So in order for us to have the conversation, even if you think, wow, that's really obvious, that's so, without sounding any kind of way, even if you think like, oh my God, a third grader could get that,
Yeah.
please bring it, please send it ahead of time, because what will happen is it will delay hearings. The only hearings that I have available to postpone are on Wednesday afternoons and Fridays, and then I could even do it at night, and I would hate to be here all night in hearings. So if we can get the numbers, even if they're available, let's really talk about the numbers, because I can't even look at that today. And for that reason, I'm thinking right now that we definitely need to come back to the hearing so that we can talk about it. And I want it to happen all before budget, but maybe I'm just going to extend it into it. So hearing how Dr. Omar Lara, hearing how they are working together, would you have any suggestions in terms of the two offices, in terms of diversity, increasing diversity, and the assistants already? Do you see anything that is missing from that work, or in terms of the partnership itself to increase diversity or address equity and inclusion?
Sure. These are just thoughts off the top of my head, just having met you all briefly. I really do think the first step is to perhaps work with IT and kind of disaggregate the data and clean it up as best as you can. And from there, you can do a historical kind of trend analysis on your workforce, the extent to which the workforce matches the population and the extent to which it doesn't, kind of looking at both sides, I think is really important. I've been an applied researcher for a long time, and I think everyone knows kind of garbage in, garbage out, not to insinuate that the data are garbage. I'm sure they are not. But to the extent that you can prioritize clean data systems and disaggregating data, right? A Latin person could be Black or white or, right, indigenous. Latin isn't really a race. And so that can be confusing when trying to address inequities, as I'm sure all of you know.
Yeah. Thank you. My colleagues have been sitting for a while, and I think the part of the wave might be hint, can we ask our questions? So I'll pass it on to my colleagues. First, to the Vice Chair, Councilor Worrell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panel, and thank you for your time to present this information to us. I have 2 or 3 questions. One, this is to Chief Solis Severus, right? Did I say that right?
Cerveza after 5, not before 5. Cervera.
All right.
You said beer.
I know.
That's a good one.
I gotta get my last name. All right. So, what role did the departments that fell underneath your cabinet play? Because I know you have
A lot.
6 or 8 of them, right?
8,
And
yeah.
each one of those departments has an executive director, right?
Yeah.
So what role did those executive directors play into helping create your process on equity impacts, equitable procurement potential, and also the role that they played in helping establish the questions for the capital budget and the operating budget?
Yeah. going to give you as concise of an answer as possible. The role up until now has been more as issues arise, I identify who in our cabinet needs to be a part of the problems, the troubleshooting, right, to identify best possible solutions. That's been the model up until now. As you can imagine, that's not sustainable for the different departments that are, you know, we have a staff of, one department is a staff of 3, and then we have another staff of like 12, and then everything in between. The model we want to create, right, is to staff the equity and inclusion office, right, sort of the, if you remember the 3 initiatives, the racial justice, that small office that provides administrative supports to the rest of the 8 departments. The goal there is to build a technical assistance network, right? We're going to call them something along the lines of equity and inclusion officers that are going to be in every single cabinet, right? So experts in streets, experts in housing, experts in procurement, et cetera. They're going to be reporting directly to this technical assistance workshop. And then so that we can build a more sustainable model rather than what we've been doing up to this time. It's like as an issue arises.
So just
Yep.
just for clarity, I just want to make sure I'm hearing this correct, that
Yep.
the executive directors from the cabinets in equity did not play a proactive role in creating what we've outlined here in the equity impacts, equitable procurement potential. Oh,
No, keep going.
okay, and like the question around equity and decision making the capital budget.
Can you tell me what slide you're referring to? I can answer quickly. About a year ago, when we were going through this process in our first year, the executive directors drafted a set of questions that they wanted OBM, Office of Budget Management, to work with as the different departments are submitting their requests. And so the questions that you see in slide, help me. The slide that is telling you the different equity questions were informed by the executive directors, yes.
Okay, and then what role do they have in the responses, and how do we evaluate each response that comes back from each department? Because under each one of the operating budgets, it says equity impacts, it's a list a bunch of questions, equitable procurement potential, then it lists a bunch of questions, and then a commitment to operational equity budget. And then on the capital, it says like the same thing, there's a bunch of questions. So how do we evaluate those questions, and who evaluates them? And is there a role that the equity department, all those departments within the equity cabinet play into evaluating those answers?
Not a formalized role.
Okay.
That is, yeah.
Yeah. I think,
But we talk a lot, so, yes.
Okay, well, I think the equity cabinet, especially if a lot of those individuals are the executive directors for the city of Boston in each one of those apartments, there should be a role for them to play in this process.
And if Councilor, if I could add, I think one of the first meetings I had when I started with the city was with Mariangeli about a budget equity scorecard. And I remember, so from the very beginning, Mari and I have been working really closely together on how to integrate her work into the budget process. The equity cabinet has had a seat at the table in all of our budget discussions, in all of our capital budget discussions. We are, within my cabinet, piloting a capital working group that will seek to sort of evaluate capital decisions across the city and help us make those decisions. And the equity cabinet has a seat at that table. It was very important that they were integrated throughout the process and really trying to formalize a role for that cabinet in our capital and operating budget decision making.
Yeah, it's just I don't want to take your time, but it's also just like a change management question here, right? Like I want our EDs to be able to sort of provide those direct services and the community engagement that's so important to the work and the policy implementation, while also all the other stuff is happening. And so we're just thinking about what are some of those protocols. So yeah.
All right. Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, no further questions.
Can I add a question to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Councilor Rowe. Chief, if you've had a say or a seat at the table, and then that means you discuss issues, inequities. And so if you've discussed inequities, then tell me what were your recommendations as a chief of equity to the budget on capital, for example?
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on this. Was one of my questions as well is, would love to hear your recommendation when it came to capital for District 4 on how a historical district, a historically black district who has been consistently underinvested when it came to the capital budget, your recommendation to the department for capital allocations this year.
FY '24.
Yep.
Just to, so budget is due to come out on April 12th, so we're not finalized yet. So I don't want to.
Well, we asked for recommendations, right? We didn't ask for the final.
Well, the one that I've already named, right, which is the gap that we have noticed. The gap that I've named is that there isn't a standardized way of prioritizing what projects are submitted into the project. I wish we could clear out our calendars and just focus on this, but we're trying to do the best quality of work, and it's going to take a little longer than we wanted. So the recommendation is what I named. We're going to create a criteria, a rubric by which, moving forward.
Got it. So no recommendations after actually looking at the budget, the numbers of the budget, and then taking a historical look at what has been allocated. Those are not the type of recommendations.
It's more systemic, right? Like ensuring that once we leave here, this is the protocols and the systems that are going to stay in place.
Okay.
But
no, and I also think that systemic is also like a tangible thing as well, right? A corrective action. I mean, were any recommendations around corrective actions made based on a historical standpoint of what has been allocated to BIPOC communities?
Absolutely, and that's, I think the beginning stages of the work around the task force to study reparations for descendants of enslaved African Americans, I think that's going to be a priority for our cabinet, and that's where investments are also going to go into.
But nothing for this year, right? No recommendations on capital budgets for BIPOC communities came from the equity department this year.
We don't have that infrastructure in our cabinet. We don't build buildings, if that makes sense.
No. I mean recommendations on how to allocate.
And it's all a process, right?
Right. All right.
Sorry, Councilor, if it's okay.
Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. And it's all a process, right? So what we want to do is engage in a conversation about where we are, where the state of things, right? So, for example, there are third-party companies such as Thrive that can actually implement these models or processes that you're talking about to Mr. Santiago's, I'm bad with names, point that essentially some of the questions that I asked were good, but that from his standpoint that he couldn't necessarily really give me hardcore numbers or answers. So, and that's okay. And I just wanted to create that platform. This is a safe space for all of us, because if we don't have the answers, the important thing to do is for all of us to say we don't have the answers. We counselors don't have the answers, and or specific to what the metric or what the implementation should be in order to change that issue, right? So I think what Councilor Worrell is getting to is saying, look, if you, the chief of equity, is in a position to be in conversations about building an equitable or recommending equitable solutions in the budget, right? And Santiago, I'm going to look at you because I read faces a lot. And so if that's the case, then how did those conversations come about? Like, were you talking specifically about inequities? Were you talking specifically about systemic change? When your response was about systemic change, it tells me that you're thinking about this in a very broad perspective. And right now, we're just looking at how do we look at what is existing, and then if that already exists, the conversations from Equity Department and OBM already is taking place, then, well, what does that look like? And then that means that you're talking about capital investments. One of my questions were, tell me the comparisons neighborhood by neighborhood. And even if I have them, say mine is a little bit off, I want to see yours. Because from equity perspective, in order for us to change systemic racism or increase diversity or teach people about equity, shouldn't we be supporting people with their social determinants of health? And we would believe that Equity Department would have a lot of say in terms of figuring out what those disparities are and how to actually supplement some of those disenfranchisements in these communities, especially the most disenfranchised community or district, which is District 4. I'm going to go to my council colleagues. Councilor Mejia was here first, and then Councilor Braden, and then back to Councilor Rowe.
So I just have, and thank you all for your work and all of the efforts being made. So I'm just curious if you can help us. I know you had a definition of equity, and I'm just curious where we talk a lot about equity and then in terms of race, but I'm just curious in terms of poverty and low income and kind of like how that fits into your racial equity framework.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's ongoing conversations in cabinet, as in the 8 departments, so that we can better, so that we become aligned on this, and that we can also educate our peers. But I would say it is front and center. We have been very intentional about who we have hired in the Equity and Inclusion Cabinet, and thinking about the intersections of race and socioeconomic status at all times.
Yeah, so let's just put a little pin there a little bit longer around the access in class. Because I do believe there is a discrepancy here. And I do believe we have an opportunity to really push ourselves and really thinking about, are we being as accessible and as intentional in creating opportunities for people who have been left out of every single opportunity here in the city of Boston. And the reason why I kind of want to lean into poverty is because that's not something that most people talk about. We focus a lot on other things, and I just kind of want to name that is definitely something that is front and center for me as we continue to talk about equity, because there is a difference between those who have and those who have not, and those who have so much more than other people who will never have anything. So I just want to name that here, because I understand my own privilege as a Latina and as someone who grew up learning how to speak English. But I'm here in this chamber, so I understand that it took a while for me to get here. But there's a lot of more discrepancies for people who don't know how to speak English still, who are having a hard time navigating city resources. And so can you just talk to me a little bit about what equity looks like for those individuals as you navigate the budget?
Counselor, who is the question for?
Whoever has the power to answer it. I want to talk specifically around how we're looking at equity and how we are looking at access to resources for people who, it's not just about being Hispanic or being Asian or being, of color, quote unquote, but it's also about their limited ability to access resources in their native language and, equity, justice for immigrant communities.
I'll take a stab at this, particularly just thinking of our language and communications access work, which is, I think I'm hearing what you're saying. It's how do we make sure that all of the resources are actually accessible to every resident, especially those who, right, do not have the privileges that you've named. The work is ongoing. Something that we just did is we recently, the LCA office, the Language and Communications Access Office, just recently trained the second floor, because that's where a lot of our staff directly interacts with. And we're working with housing, we're working with EOI, Economic Opportunity and Inclusion, to continue to do some of the work that you all are doing, right, of getting workshops out into the community, et cetera, because anywhere I go, anywhere we go, we find out, oh, we didn't know that you had that resource. And thinking about media in different ways and allocating funding into those different ways so that we're reaching different residents, not just in the traditional website ways. But I don't know if anybody has to.
I'm happy to weigh in. Again, I think that your point is well taken around there's intersectionality in these issues. I'm a non-native speaker, I'm an immigrant. For me, getting credit to buy a house is much harder because I don't have a credit history in the country, so then I have to start from scratch. This is not for me personally. And so I think that when we work from the data standpoint, when departments are saying, hey, I'm interested in looking at a particular issue, we emphasize to them, you gotta understand the intersectionality of the issue, understand what are other determinants that drive the types of disparities. Is it language access? Is it immigration status? Is it race, ethnicity, age? We know that a lot of, for instance, in digital equity, we know that a lot of the barriers end up being concentrated in elderly residents. So I think that what we've been doing and what we all do working together is then go and work with the different groups within Mariangeli's cabinet and say, okay, like, if we want to bring a lens of understanding the immigrant experience around a particular program, let's talk with people that already have the relationships with advocates and the immigrant community to try to understand how is it that we can design a program that is more accessible, that meets and understands some of those nuances. Did that a little bit, más o menos?
Yeah, más o menos.
Sorry.
Am I done?
No, is it okay if I allow?
Oh, yeah, I wasn't sure if you were going to.
Oh, no. I think Dr. Lara can offer more to your.
Yeah, Councilor Mejia, I wanted to offer our definition of equity. And our definition of equity is mitigating disparities to break cycles of poverty, right? And so the idea, and we do that through two different methods. One is money, that's resource allocation. The other is power, and that's elevating kind of community voices in decision-making, because communities know what they need, as we saw in Somerville, as our colleague on the Zoom presented. And so to kind of get down to the essence of it, every single government agency has within its jurisdiction the power to break cycles of poverty. If it's the school system, then you deal with the achievement gap. If it's housing, then you don't just shelter people, but you also figure out how folks can accumulate wealth and purchase homes. If it's procurement, then how are we as a city kind of buying services from diverse small businesses? And so the mindset is, it doesn't really matter kind of what the agency is. Every single government agency can break cycles of poverty. And then you walk back from that, and this is getting to the kind of data issue. What are the key metrics in a particular agency that are related to disparities and also these endless or seemingly endless cycles of poverty? And so inherent in our definition of equity, you actually will never see anything about race. It is really about obliterating cycles of poverty generation after generation.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I think because having grown up in poverty, I'm very super sensitive to how we break the cycles of what we're here to talk about today in terms of like how the government plays a role in keeping us where we are, right? It's very, everything is intentional, right? So if the goal is for us to lean into this conversation in a way that is going to help us disrupt those cycles of poverty for people, then I'd love to look at what that looks like. I'm also curious about staffing in your in the city of Boston, in particular in terms of just the cabinet and I'm really excited to know that the city and the mayor has been really super intentional about diversity. But I'm curious in terms of if I look at the city as a whole, if I were the one to have the ability, I'd be like, okay, this neighborhood has high percentage of X, Y, and Z. Can we just distribute the funds based on the number of people that live in that neighborhood, the number of people who are experiencing poverty, the racial background, and just say, you're going to get this district, to Councilor Worrell's point, whether it be capital or just investments. Are you using anything like that looks at the city as a whole and then looks at the neighborhoods that have had the least investments and have had the highest need in terms of your budgeting process?
So if I could just make sure I'm understanding your question, do we use neighborhood information when we're making budget allocation decisions? Yes. I think that comes most into play in our capital discussions, right? Because there's a physical asset in a place, so it's easy for us to see what dollars are going to a particular project in a particular neighborhood. So that's the area where it's easiest for us to see. I think when we think about the operating budget, it's a little bit harder to slice and dice it by neighborhood.
But if I'm hearing my colleagues, and I've seen, and Councilor Anderson has been amplifying this, that certain districts get more than others. So if you are using that framework, then I'm just curious why districts like D4 and D7 have historically had less investments on the capital front.
I'd be happy to follow up with more information on sort of the rubrics in which we evaluate, and I think my team just sent it to me, the way we make decisions around the capital plan. So, sorry, if you just give me 2 seconds to pull it up.
That's fine. I just want to think that there's an opportunity there for us to
absolutely
really figure out how we are investing in certain districts or not. And then I know I'm going to get the buzzer soon, so I wanted to I see that we have defined youth, housing, and climate as the number one, the issues of most in need here in the city of Boston. And I'm just curious if you could just help me understand, like when I think about communities across the city and when I think about the neighborhoods that I spend a lot of time in, we talk about violence, we talk about social determinants of health, we talk a lot about other things, and climate doesn't seem to bubble up to the top of like priorities for communities who are struggling to make their ends meet. So I'm just curious, like when we're thinking about this conversation, can we educate our public who is tuning in, kind of the intersection of climate, so that they can see why climate has become an equity? I know what it says here, but I think it's important for those who are tuning in to understand the interconnectedness of that, just because I think it's important, because oftentimes, especially communities of color, we don't think that climate is an issue that is in terms of investments. We want to make sure that we have food on our table, that we're getting jobs, and that all of these things. So if you could just, for the public, help them understand how climate ended up in one of the top priorities here.
Yeah, absolutely. I put that in this slide, and I think that the counselor had asked what were some of these investments that we know that help alleviate disparities. The risk of climate change, of flooding and increased heat and also increased cold, the disparities tend to impact the populations that are the most vulnerable the hardest. So homeless population, people that have housing insecurity, they are the ones who will stand to suffer the most. And if there's a catastrophic event, think about Katrina in New Orleans, and where a substantial percentage of the population has to be displaced, the people that will have the hardest time recovering from that are the people that don't have permanent housing, that don't have insurance. So it is, to your point, sometimes we don't always have the awareness because it is overwhelming in thinking all the things that we have to deal with in the day-to-day. But it is when things go wrong that the people that are the most vulnerable always take the short end of the stick. So that's where I think that the approach that the mayor has called on all of us is to think about that intersectionality of where is it that we can think about, the Green New Deal for Boston Public Schools, and, like starting to think about how is it that we make it more tangible and more intersectional, and thinking there's a real risk that will impact this population the most, and we need to get in front of it.
Yeah, no, I deeply appreciate that as someone who over the last 3 years has learned a lot about climate and the impact. So I really do appreciate that, and I am asking that question more for those who are tuning in and need to understand the why, because I'm clear with it. And then the last thing that I would say is that, for me, it's about the most immediate needs for people. Right? There's a long term, there's a long game, and there's the short term. So a lot of folks right now are trying to figure out how they're going to make their ends meet, how they're going to, So I think that is what a lot of our people are looking to us to come to the table with is like, this is how the city is going to address X, Y, and Z. And I'm still unclear about how that looks. And I'm going to assume, because we're just starting off the budget cycle conversations, we haven't seen the budget yet. I'm excited to see kind of like how those dollars are going to be allocated. But I do think that for me, I have a very different perspective now in how I'm going to be navigating these conversations, because there's a level of understanding that we are embarking on with this particular hearing. But I also think with the participatory budget process is going to enlighten us in ways that we hope will deliver on those conversations. But I think, at the end of the day, having grown up here in the city of Boston, the budget is the value, and if people's lives are not improving and we just keep having the same conversation and expecting different results, then we're all just wasting our time and energy and the city dollars if we're not delivering some really specific results for people.
Thank you.
I like to see that now.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. So I think we're not really getting to the bottom line of things, right? And I feel like it's not us. I feel like it's the process of these types of meetings, right? Technical term, hearing, or even the working session. I sit here way across from you, and there are cameras everywhere, and then I talk at you, and then you talk at me, because really it's a presentation then versus presentation. We ask questions, then you answer in small increments because we all got to get to the next question. And then we kind of like circle back, but it feels like, wait, was there any continuity to our conversation? So where did the conversation go, right? So if we could actually format conversations in these hearings in a way that we can actually measure the conversation itself, because I don't know how much progress we've made in this conversation itself. However, I don't think it's us. I really don't. I don't think it's you. I don't think it's us, right? I feel like it's the process. Because and last year I went through that, and I thought a lot about this year. Should I be developing syllabus for the hearings themselves? Like, should I be looking at okay, wait, first we're gonna go into presentations, you know what I mean? Like, and then we actually have like note takers live. Like, how do we do this so we can say, okay, so we've covered capital, and we didn't, right? We don't understand what the process is. Even if you tell me councilors have an opportunity to talk to the mayor beforehand, or that equity department is in the conversation. Okay, but how or what exactly? What's the standard? What are the recommendations? Or that diversity and inclusion or that chief of departments all make the recommendations. We haven't actually established the answer to the solution in this conversation. And I don't know how much progress we've made, but I'm not going to belabor the point. I will come back to clarifying questions after. First, I wanted to go to my council colleague, and then I wanted to just, if we can sort of revisit where we are in this conversation itself, just so that we can sort of take the, have the takeaways from this conversation so far. I think it will lead us to where we are next and determining whether or not we need another hearing. Councillor Braden, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to go back to the demographic data question. The analytics department and demographic data analysis, and then we're talking about how challenging it is when we talk about intersectionality. Like how do we classify our people? We worked on the census last year, trying to get a census recount, and we talked to. Do you have a demographer in your department?
We do not have a demographer, people with that educational background. We have people that have backgrounds in statistics and other backgrounds, but not not a demographer.
Yeah, because one issue that we keep coming up against across all discussions about different departments is we actually really need a research department with a fully fledged demographic capacity. We have to go cap in hand to the wonderful folks over at the BPDA who help us out with our demographic questions. So I think that's the notion, that a Brazilian, someone's a Brazilian, but the Brazilians are invisible in our city because they're either white or black, but they're not, they're not recognized as their own group. There's other instances like that as well. So I think are we really got the tools in the bag so that we can do this work well? The other question I had was really just about, and we had a conversation, a very recent conversation about information systems and the administrative information systems that are as our integrated financial and human resources management system that is designed to track and control daily activities and report on the financial position of the city. It's called BAIS. BAIS? BAIS, sorry. BAIS performs the specialized functions of encumbrance control, budget control, position management, payment allotment, reporting, fund accounting, and capital project and grant management. And so in about $15 million in capital funds were appropriated in 2012 through 2017 to upgrade the system. And then during last night's procurement hearing, it was indicated that this wasn't completed until last year. Do we have a fully fledged system that's ready? It's fully working up to its full capacity and able to do the job?
Yeah, I can answer both. So BAIS is one of the systems that are...
Sorry,
yes.
Chief, can you just give me a moment? I apologize. I just looked at my time. Chief Mariangelis, I know that you had a pre-engagement, and we thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No worries. That's right.
Thank you for the seat.
Thank you, Councilor Braden.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, BAIS is the system that most city departments and agencies use for HR and finance. Maintaining a large, complex system is like owning any asset. You have to continuously do improvements. So obviously, I've been here for 10 months, so I can only comment on what's happened in the past 10 months. Since we had our budget hearing, we've migrated BAIS to be hosted in the cloud, and I can tell you a little bit more about this, but it's a very timely migration because we were able to avert some downtime issues that we had with the existing infrastructure. And as we mentioned about how we classify race and gender, it is always going to be a work in progress in terms of maintaining the system to work to our needs. We work very closely with Ashley and with Alex as my primary customers because they manage the finance and the HR functions to make this work better. So just say there was work that was done before. We always see an opportunity for improvement, and in our case, we align our investments in terms of equity. So the two areas where we've been focusing on improvements for BAIS have been on the vendor portal to make it more accessible from a language perspective, from a small business perspective, improving how it is to navigate. So we're just in the early stages of design of that. And then the second project that we've been working on with with the People's Cabinet has been around hiring, to have a better process, one that promotes more diversity in departments. So do we have the tools? There's always room for more tools and more resources. I think that the BPDA and us, this is why I emphasize the American Community Survey and the census, we all have some limitations around the kinds of data that we have to do this kind of evaluation and be able to get some of this information. We've been working with finance and with others to try to get more information and more data that we can use to supplement this. I know that, again, we support almost every cabinet, so around how is it that we make sure that we're tracking our goals around promoting tourism, how is it that we're promoting the success of the transit benefits for our low-income residents and employees. So there's room for more tools and room for growth, and I think that we're, this past year and hopefully in the next year, we'll be making even more improvements around both the tools and the kinds of detail that we can have. And some of these are things that, like, when it comes to very targeted geographic information about like how many people live in a particular ward, what their demographic information, that's limited by the census and the American Community Survey. That's
So, you know, I know we had a conversation about GIS and thinking about. It seems like the GIS gives us an incredible tool. If we had an enterprise-wide GIS system that was servicing and supporting every department, it seems like a really important tool to have in this work for equity, or just knowing where our capitals, you know, in every aspect of what we talk about in equity. If we don't have an upstanding GIS department with and demographers and folks who can really understand the intricacies of all this intersectionality and how all of these factors impact poverty and equity and health outcomes, you know, it seems like we've got great aspirations, but we're really like jousting at windmills unless we have the tools and the system set up that we can actually actualize what we're wanting to do.
We have an enterprise agreement, and we have other tools for data analysis. The city actually invests every year a fair amount of money both in the licensing and in the tools. I think that I would like to see, and obviously I'm not getting ahead of what hopefully gets formalized in the budget, but around training. So we have the tools, but to the extent that departments know how to access the tools and how to use the tools to answer the questions that you're asking about, like both in the implementation and operations of the department's work, I think that that's where there's the biggest room for opportunity. And from an equity perspective as well, training for our staff is what enables them to grow within the organization and take new jobs and get promoted and whatnot. So that I think that would be the piece that I think that is where there's the biggest opportunity.
And I know we talk a lot, we're all great advocates. We're district councillors, we fight for our districts. We fight like hell for our districts. And we try and get resources for our constituents. But even within our districts, you know, if you just look at the district level, you need to actually get down into the more granular, you know, almost down into individual census tracts to see where there are pockets of deep poverty, different heat island effects, deforestation and deficient housing, you know, so that we, places where we get much more complaints about housing standards, etc. So we really need to have those tools so that we can really, with surgical precision, go in and attack the problem where it's at. Because if you look at a district, like, I'll take out District 9, Alston, Brighton, in terms of tree canopy, for example. On aggregate, it looks like we're doing pretty well. And then you go to Alston Village and Lower Alston, there isn't a tree in sight. And so we have incredible heat island effects in a district that looks pretty good on average. But, you know, it's that thing of we need to really sort of win with precision to be able to identify the problem and then come up with the solutions to identify it. And I also want to thank you for your presentation. I'm very inspired by the work you're doing. I think it's very based on good data, and it's very helpful to think about it in that way as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Councilor Braden. Mrs. Santiago, you mentioned that, we do have the tools, but can you explain that? We have the tools, but implementation is the problem. So what do you mean by that?
So again, and I think that the challenge when we talk about a lot of these pieces is that there's a fair amount of nuance. So we have an enterprise agreement for GIS that covers every city employee. Now, not every department, again, is enabled or uses
An enterprise agreement for what?
for GIS, for the geospatial information system, the system
thank
that,
you.
and again, we have an enterprise system for finance and HR. We have a data analytics platform that is what powers the dashboard. Yeah, these are millions of rows of data that we're able to visualize in the dashboard, and we have.
So why aren't we getting the data straight?
We have it. It's online publicly. I pulled up the. But anyways,
But the nuances and the different subcategories and the intersectionalities are getting crossed somehow.
Well, again, like if in the particular dashboard that you're referring to, the information you can see the intersectionality between the ethnic and race categories, with gender, with pay, with position levels, with tenured, and so that data, and that is data that is directly coming from our base system.
So
from our information
implementation,
system.
where's the problem with implementation?
I think that where there's an opportunity, what I was referring to is there's an opportunity to train people. The data, we have a lot of data, and we're also missing some data. There's data around acids, around trees, around a number of things that we're missing. But we do have some data, and I think that to the extent that we're training every hiring manager, every person that's making decisions in the day-to-day of the city to know that that information is available to them so that they can be supported in data to make better decisions. That's where I think that there's the biggest opportunity in training our staff, training people so that they know where they can access the resources.
Maybe we can just start with the decision makers.
Yes.
I mean, if you're saying, if folks are getting hired and the qualification that's missing is this lack of training, are they missing a certain qualification and therefore they need to be trained before they can be equitable in their decisions?
I think that what I'm referring to is knowing how to use the tools, knowing that the tools exist.
I see.
That is,
so from a data perspective, IT, right, perspective, you're like, hey, look, we have the tools. That information can be readily available. But for example, me, just the other day, I filed to amplify and make information accessible, like how we vote, what I file by category on our pages. Had I known that this tool existed, why haven't I been using it? So I need the training in order for me to go and figure it out. Something like that, it's an example. And so access for even our own employees in terms of implementing or using the tools that we have is an issue within itself. But isn't the fact that as a city, though, we haven't aggregated this information so that it can inform the budget? For example, if you say to me, we are doing this budget equitably, then I would say, oh, then you know exactly where the inequities are, right? Because you're doing the budget equitably. You are creating a budget that addresses, because literally the mayor's responsibility, the city's responsibility, the councilors, we are supposed to be making sure that we provide living, fair living, equitable living for our citizens. And so we would have had a responsibility to look at the inequities, to say, right here in Mattapan, we need this type of housing. Over here in Roxbury, we need this type of park, like the one that the doctor showed. Over here, where people have issues with food, right? And then so we begin to address these social determinants of health in different ways because we have the data. But if we keep going back and forth about we don't understand how to use the tools in order for us to just be like, I understand because I know how to use these tools that the city's already providing. This is not on you, Mrs. Santiago. This is the fact that we have so much information, so much technology, and we're not able to have the research ready to inform our budget? Because that's why we're here overall. We're trying to figure out how are we addressing equity in the budget. And so to take that, all of those resources, and to give it to departments to inform their recommendations, conversations in order to make the budget equitable.
Yeah, if I may, I think what I would want to say is, look, as we acknowledge, all of these things are a work in progress. As people and again, I have visibility into some of the pieces. I put together my budget, the budget for our department, and we work with other people that use data when they're putting together proposals and stuff. Like, I know that a number of people, and when we're making recommendations around capital investments, operational changes, we were asked to provide justifications around how each of those investments impacted equity. And I would say that some people used data and looked at the information around what the disparities were to justify those investments. I think that is the piece of the process that defer to Ashley to talk about the process, but there are people that have been using data to identify the disparities. But to your point, the issues are so complex that you talk about disparities in housing and youth, like there's not a comprehensive scorecard of everything. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We agree.
Okay. Yeah.
Where is the professional that makes those recommendations? Because who has time? That's a job within itself, right? To look at the data. It's not Chief Lauren's job to look after doing her job. After all of that, increasing diversity is one thing. It's a task within its own then to retain. And it's a task, another whole big project to collaborate with equity and inclusion, to be able to create curriculums and all of these trainings to implement all of this programming in the city of Boston. That's a lot. And then everything else that I don't know about your job. And then to be able to look at all this data, I mean, I have to go read it up. And then to look at all this data and say, are we actually addressing equity in the budget? Nope. I think the answer is that we're not doing that properly, or we're not doing that at all. And if we are doing that, you're saying some people are using the tools so they navigate it well enough. Some people are using data, and some people have information, and some people don't. And so if that's how we're functioning, then shouldn't we ensure that we actually know why we're allocating and what we're allocating? You know what I mean? And I think it's just, I honestly feel like it's because that doesn't exist. It's because we are not actually implementing. And I'm not asking questions for you to give me answers, because I don't think it lives in your department. I think I'm saying that in order for this to come together, the work that needs to happen is not happening. I'm saying that there's tools to get the data. You can aggregate it, you can get it on the dashboard. You said some people use it, some people don't. And not everybody is an expert on equity or how to do this. So something's missing. Would you agree?
I think that and as we stated, with all of the work, there's many opportunities of improvement. I think that we have a baseline that we've shared. And again, my recommendation, the approach that we've been taking, at least in our department, is how do we enable more decision makers with the tools to make the right decisions, because they're able to see the gaps. And that's the tools that the council offices use to see the GIS maps and all these things we provide. But there's, I think, opportunities for improvement. So I would say we do use data. We use data I remember my first council session with my budget hearing with you last year.
Thank you, Mrs. Santiago. I think, I'll give you one more example. And if the public, the people here for public testimony, Ms. Maya Milik and Hussein Rizvi, if you guys can make your way to the mic, please. We're going to go to you next. And I think in terms of capital, and we can address it in our second round, but in terms of capital, you can look at the different communities and you can make comparisons. Right now, I can ask Councilor Worrell what his community needs in order to address social determinants of health, in order to address the disparities, he's going to be able to tell you. And he hasn't looked at the data that you're talking about. Do you know what I mean? So I think because we're on the ground and we see the issues and we know, just by looking at the capital improvements and understanding systemic racism, we know that the social determinants of health for people in District 4 are not properly being addressed. And so what's that conversation look like in capital? So for example, if I build a housing development, but it doesn't offer any amenities, it doesn't offer any quality, it doesn't offer a nice park for me to go and decompress, it doesn't offer opportunities for careers or a scholarship, if it doesn't offer a gym for me to take care of my health because my mental health is suffering, because I live in an impoverished community where my streets are always dirty because 311 doesn't respond on time. You know what I mean? Now I'm depressed and I'm poor and I got to take care of my kids. And who addresses that? Do you see what I'm saying? So like we can look at those numbers and we can look at those issues, and we've figured out that in our communities we need a certain level of capital investments, but we don't see that. We didn't see that in the last budget. We look forward to seeing the recommendations coming up on the 12th. So exciting and scared at the same time. So, but Ms. Maya Millick, can you introduce yourself and your affiliation, where you're from, and your testimony, please? You have 3 minutes.
Sure.
Thank you.
Hi. Firstly, just wanted to say thank you to the Boston City Council Committee on Ways and Means, and especially to the chair and co-sponsor of this docket, Councilor Fernandez-Anderson, for this opportunity to share testimony today. My name's Maya Millick, and I'm here on behalf of Boston Liberation Health. We're a group of health and mental health providers and service users who are advocating for social justice and liberation, both here in Boston and around the world. We were started about 20 years ago by a group of clinical social workers here in Boston, and now have over 2,700 members worldwide. So I'm here today because last year, the City of Boston chose Boston Liberation Health and the City School to facilitate a community-led design group tasked with creating a mental health crisis response model that doesn't involve law enforcement. So over the course of 9 months, 14 community members, all with lived and or professional experience in mental health crisis response, designed a model that's rooted in racial, economic, gender, queer, and disability justice. This model was also informed by local and national crisis response groups working with those most impacted by the current police response. So as the City of Boston commits to addressing inequities through budget priorities, we're here today to sort of advocate for fully funding the pilot of this model at $2.6 million for the 2024 budget in order to promote health, justice, and equity in the City of Boston. We're happy to provide more information on the model or the design process upon request. And we'll also include the final kind of comprehensive report on the model that was shared with the mayor in our written testimony via email as well. So thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Maya. Mr. Hussein?
Yeah, hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. Hello and good evening. My name is Hussein Rizvi, and I work for the City School, a nonprofit based in Dorchester focused on the political education and leadership development of BIPOC youth in Boston. We were chosen, City School was chosen, alongside Boston Liberation Health to facilitate that process to envision a mental health crisis response model that doesn't involve law enforcement. I know we've been talking a lot about what are some concrete recommendations, and I definitely feel like the model that we were able to generate over the past year is one of those concrete recommendations. I'm here to add our organizations and our young people's voices to advocate for the full funding of the pilot model at $2.6 million for the 2024 budget to promote health, justice, and equity in the City of Boston. Our young people in our communities need access to mental health crisis care that will not further criminalize or endanger them. Funding and implementing this model would put reality to that vision and would be a concrete way for the City of Boston to commit to centering equity in this next budget. The comprehensive report is available online at the City Schools websites and Boston Liberation Health, and it will also be submitted in testimony. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Councilor Rowe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And I missed a little bit of your testimony, Dr. sorry.
Omolara.
Omolara.
Yes.
But I also have reached out to Brian McClure from DC and discussed what they implemented in DC to talk about the impacts that policy and budgeting has. I think they have like an analysis based on each policy that gets passed to the city council, and they have like their own council, I think it's called Council Office of Racial Equity, that kind of does this analyst for them as well, just to talk about the impacts of not only policy, but the budget line items that come through the council. Also spoke with Mr. Goodwin from GARE, who sounds like he does similar to the type of work on teaching municipalities on how to take a racial equity look at their budget and their policy as well. So I think there's definitely much needed, that this is much needed here in the city of Boston, and would love to work with you, Councilor Anderson, and on how do we make that a reality here. My one recommendation is we do have an equity department, for the administration, is just making sure that those lived experiences and those executive directors are part of this conversation and this process, and trying to formalize that as much as possible. That's my only question and recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Worrell. Councilor Mejia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here. I think that Councilor Breeden was kind of getting us to a point where I think we need to go in terms of just kind of like how we move forward with these sort of conversations. And, it doesn't seem like there's a consistent standard in terms of how we're making decisions. Like, I'd like to know, is it 100% equity? Is it 50%? Is it 20%? Is it 5%? Is it all city departments? Like, it would be great to understand how you're holding city departments accountable to equity in their budgeting process. Is there a standard that you're using to define how you determine your allocations?
So every department that submits a proposal to the budget office for inclusion in the budget is required to provide answers to those equity questions that I outlined. So 100% of our departments are required to be thinking about equity in their proposals. Mm-hmm. And so it is a factor that goes into the decision-making for how we allocate budget resources.
So, no, I appreciate that 100% of folks are using it, but then I guess what I want to lean in a little bit more on is what the return on that investment looks like. So if 100% are doing that, then how are you then doing the calculations per dollar based on their assessment? How are you checking yourself on that process?
In how we use that information to make those decisions. Mm-hmm. So it is a factor that goes into our decision-making process. There's not a standard formula that we apply to each one, but it is an important consideration that goes into our decision-making process.
So a factor is not so I think that this is probably one of the reasons why we're having this conversation, right? So there's a factor, there's a standard, and then there's a commitment. Mm-hmm. And I guess what we're trying to get at, and I guess I'm assuming that's probably where we're trying to go, is where is the commitment to lead with equity? Mm-hmm. Because you said it's a factor, yeah. And I think language means everything, mm-hmm. right? And so, especially for those folks who are tuning in, it is important for us to be intentional mm-hmm. and deliberate mm-hmm. and committed to it. So instead of saying a factor, can you share with me a different word that feels more like we're going to put a ring on this finger, okay?
I appreciate the question. So I would say, the mayor has made it extremely clear to me and all of the cabinet chiefs and all of the department heads that it is the expectation that equity and community is at the root of all of our work, whether it's part of I can't think of a better word. I'm sorry. Whether it is contributing to the decision-making process, it is the expectation that the work we are doing is rooted in our community, from beginning to end. All
right. I don't know about all that, but I'll let you live with that one. So I guess what I'm just really trying to get us to is a point where we can definitively say, here's what we're going to do for Boston residents. Here's our commitment, and here's the dollar amount that we're going. I just feel like that doesn't feel to me at this point that I'm hearing that from y'all.
And I'm really excited to come back and talk to you about the budget that we'll be introducing. I think this will be made so much more clear with actual examples.
Yeah.
So very excited to return back to you all and talk about some of the investments that we are planning to make in this upcoming budget, and talk to you more about our expectation of outcomes and how we came to those decisions. So I think it'll be really exciting to return back.
Because right now, I know you wanted to share something.
Yeah, I would just humbly recommend really precise metrics contained to geographic locations. Right. So we have 10,000 opportunity youth. I don't know the numbers, and I don't want to say, I'm just using a round number. We have 1,000 opportunity youth in District 4. And we want to get that number down by N%. And we are spending money on this particular program, and the performance metrics associated are, we're going to connect you to housing, we're going to connect you to work, and we don't want you just to have a job for a day, but we actually want you to retain a job, right? And so I guess the recommendation is to identify specific and clear actual populations, like an actual number of actual humans somewhere, and then identify how, in terms of equity, we want to break cycles of poverty, get folks in housing, deal with the racial wealth gap, whatever. But you have to have you have to have a number that everybody can point to at the beginning of the budget season and at the end of the budget season. And we know if and to what extent we move the needle on that particular indicator. And you don't have to solve all of the city's problems all in one day, but if you prioritize these 10 metrics for these 24 months and then the next metrics for the next, it just becomes less abstract.
That's right.
And more precise.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I'm a visual learner, and I feel like for me, every time I come into this chamber, I always leave trying to crack the Da Vinci Code, go on Google, figure out half of the things that have been said here so that I can understand, and then process it, and then regurgitate it to the people that follow me so that they can understand how we're utilizing their money. And I really do appreciate you serving as my translator here, because I think that you understand exactly what I'm trying to get at. And I think that that's why so many people are frustrated with us just in general, because it feels to me, to Councilor Anderson's point, that we are like little hamsters going around and just trying to get to an answer. And I just feel like I leave here with more questions. And I feel like we have such an amazing opportunity to really pause and think about, are we really having the impact that we say we want to have? And how are we holding ourselves accountable to that impact in ways that people can actually feel? Like people can actually say, yes, my quality of life has improved, or yes, I feel like X, Y, and Z, and yes, the government is working for me. Because right now, entering the budget season, I know I'm excited to see what happens on April the 12th, but until I see that in a way that makes sense to everyday people, it's just going to be a whole bunch of pretty little words that are on a PowerPoint presentation that I'm absolutely going to have to ask you to potentially have to thrive to come back and help me understand, because otherwise it's just politics as usual, and that's just all that I will say.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. All right, well, I guess just our segue is, so I wanted to just sort of summarize how far we've come, and I think you guys can help me do that. So in summation, I understand that the Department of Equity, the different departments or the cabinet of equity, the different departments that it entails, that it also entails 3 different initiatives, and that there is a effort to collect demographics and data collection for ARPA grants, compensation study prioritization, capital budget prioritization criteria, but that wasn't clear today exactly what that looks like because the council doesn't see that. And Councilor Worrell, I think you had a question to that point.
Thank you, Chair. And I think on one of these graphs or slides, there was a list of questions in equity and decision-making, capital budget. And those questions were, where's the work, who's impacted, who is it for, how it will be implemented, and what will the impact of the outcome be? Is this something that the budget team fills out, or who answers all these questions?
Departments that are submitting proposals to the budget team will answer those questions.
And is this done like by email, or is it like a form?
I don't know. I'd have to get back to you on how that information is collected. I don't know if it's written or if it's part of meetings and conversations.
It's both.
It's both?
It's both. It's both. Thank you.
It's both? Okay.
It's both. 'Cause if right now we filed a 17F to get that information, we would have to get whatever's electronic. So if it's electronic, it's electronic. And if it's in writing still, legally, we should talk about it and create transparency by just, and I think the chief is, I don't want to say new, but newer in this process.
Okay.
But it's both. Last year, I think one of the folks from OBM had mentioned it, and we got clarification that it was both.
So I guess that leads me to the question of asking, is it possible to take a look at the capital budget requests that are coming from the departments and see what we're prioritizing over what we're not?
I think we can certainly share information when the recommended capital plan comes out in a few weeks about, what's included and have conversations about information we received and how we processed that in terms of what got into the plan and what is deferred.
All right, so we'll be able to have a list on what was able, what was tabled.
Yeah, we can have that conversation.
Thank you.
So, as a chair, I'm asking you to submit those information from all departments as soon as you can, please. Preferably before the budget. That would give us a really good idea of what direction we're going. We hate to 17F. I think that here in the city of Boston, this administration is very transparent, and I've been able to obtain information by just asking. So I don't think that I need to go and file a 17F. These poor policy research students. But I think we could just ask you, and you could just submit them, in the spirit of transparency. We really need to see it. We really need to be able to say, Parks asked for this much in Back Bay for parks, and this much in Roxbury for parks, and we need to be able to say, okay, how are these decisions being made? And I think it goes the same for operating, but except, I think it's each chief in their departments sending a certain budget. I think a conversation probably would happen. It's like if I was
Like the executive director, right?
Right. If I was the OBM department, I would be like, let's have a conversation about what your budget, what you're asking for in operating, and then I would be like, okay, well, this is how much we can play with. But so I think we're just trying to get to the bottom of what is the process of asking for capital? How are the communities or neighborhoods prioritized? And then compare that to what was rejected, and then compare that by neighborhood, and then look at it and say, well, for example, last year, why did Mattapan get $54 million, but Fenway got close to $300 million? Oh, okay, because the school and Muddy River. Oh, but why? Oh, because that was in planning for a long time. Okay, but if I had 5 children, and I knew that there was one that couldn't plan for itself. There was one child that, my special child, my child that I knew I had to prioritize because that child does not plan for himself. I would prioritize that child. I would say that child needs me the most. And I think that's what's missing. You know what I mean? And so it's always like, well, when we get to the why, well, why can we get the money? Well, because it was in planning. Or why? Because the study hasn't been done. Well, why? Or nobody brought it up. No, people are bringing it up. You know what I mean? Black people, brown people, disenfranchised communities are bringing it up. They're saying, we're dying. They're saying, hey, we die 30 years faster than Back Bay. Why? That's not fair. And so it's not for this department. We all want good for everyone. It's not for you to come up with all of the solutions together, but I think together we're saying, let's look at these things critically and let's implement the metrics that Dr. Malauulu is talking about in order for us to actually pragmatically monitor and measure the progress. We can't possibly measure progress, especially with ARPA. In ARPA, there was $5 million last year suggested just to measure whether ARPA was going to be used equitably. But then the recommendations were already made.
Right.
And so how do you measure a thing after spending the money? But you already recommended where the money was going to go. But technically, ARPA was supposed to be for the disenfranchised, or at least the priority should have been. And so we got to get out of that practice where we're doing it backwards. Mm-hmm. Here's the money, and then later, oops, there was no plan for Mattapan. Well, why? Because Mattapan didn't, I guess, cry loud enough. You know what I mean? Right. So it's not you, per se, the chiefs here today that is responsible for this, but where's the issue? Okay, systemic racism. There's the issue. Okay, well, how do we tackle it? You know what I mean? And these things are perpetuated well before our time. But there are tools that exist, one sitting right next to you, that can actually, curve this thing. And I don't know Dr. Malauulu. I heard about the program. I said, hey, can you come and show me this? But the point is that there are others, and there's that, and we can do this differently. Did you?
That's it. Thank you. That's it.
I would say that what I got from it is we don't have metrics. We're not implementing them yet. We have tools that chiefs or departments can use in order to aggregate data, in order to become more efficient in looking at the data, but that we actually need to train people. That probably means increasing staff capacity in order to do that. And then we also need information on what people are asking in the Capitol. That form that they fill out and they say, this park, that park, this is my recommendation, or this housing, or this program, we need that. We want to be able to understand, because if we, the counselors, don't even know what people are recommending in our districts, that's a failure in policy and in process. We should all be included in this conversation because we are the closest to our constituents in our districts. And so from this, I think I would like to move into a working session, probably virtually. One, because I think more people can attend. Two, because I think we really need to be able to create an outline. And virtually we can do that. Virtually we can actually present things and say, what about A? What about B? And what about C? And we can actually look at, in a working session, we can actually look at ways of understanding exactly what's being implemented and what's not being implemented. And I think that's a fairer conversation than to sit here and just ask you questions and you're like, actually my job is this. So we're not oblivious to that. We're just trying to say, thank you for being gracious and being here within this conversation. I look forward to continuing with you. We have a long journey. Budget season is approaching, and hopefully it will look like this. It'll be about transparency and how we can dig deeper. It'll get a little bit more complex because my council colleagues are really colorful and there'll be a lot more in personalities. But I promise you, if there's transparency and we can go back and forth, and if there's patience, we can actually get to the bottom of the conversation and do this more equity thing more intentionally. Do you have any questions or comments before we close?
No, just thank you for having us here. It's an important conversation, and I know it's just the beginning, so thank you for giving the space to have us here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Session's adjourned.